The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
This episode of Bring Back V10s is brought to you by F1 Experiences, the official experience, hospitality and travel program of Formula One. F1 Experiences offers exclusive access to the world of F1, including pit walks, paddock access, rare photo opportunities and guided circuit tours, to name just a few of the things you can do. And who better to ask for advice on how to get the most out of attending an F1 weekend than a man who's been to hundreds of Grand Prix, our very own Ed Straw. So Ed, in the unlikely event of us giving you the weekend off and you being free to go to the event with F1 Experiences, what would be at the top of your to-do list?
The glamour is part of Formula One, and everyone should at least once in their lives enjoy a day in Formula One's paddock club, soaking up the atmosphere with fine food and their beverage of choice. It will also offer a great view of the track, the paddock and the pits, so you can get close to the heart of F1. Just make sure that once you've done that, you head out trackside to get up close and personal with the cars, which after all is what it's all about.
For me, it's got to be the photo opportunity with the World Championship trophies. They're iconic, not seen in public that often, and of course I'd be straight in there looking for the commemoration of Jacques Villeneuve's 1997 season. Those are our tips here at Bring Back V10s. To find out more and to book your own F1 experience, visit f1experiences.com. One of the most famous races of our beloved V10 era happened right towards the end of the final season in 2005, when a mixed-up grid set up an incredible afternoon of racing that was settled with a pass for the win on the final lap. We are, of course, talking about the 2005 Japanese Grand Prix today on Bring Back V10s, and how Kimi Raikkonen pulled off one of his most sensational victories with McLaren. Joining me, Glenn Freeman, to look back on that weekend are two men who were there at Suzuka. Mark Hughes, who was reporting on that weekend, and former McLaren mechanic Marc Priestley, who was working on Raikkonen's car. So, two Marks on the show, which won't at all get confusing. Now, Mark Hughes, I'll come to you first. When you think back to Suzuka 2005, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
After the race, I was, the standard thing, you're going to find as many people as you can, as many drivers and team people. And I was trying to find Pat Symonds, and of course he was gutted because he'd just lost the race on the last lap. And they'd lost the race twice, in fact, because they felt they'd lost it with Alonso, with what happened in race control, which we'll talk about later. But they'd also lost it with Fissy, with that pass on the last lap by Kimi. And so he was very reluctant to talk, and I was sort of following him around, and he was just trying to avoid me. But eventually I hung around long enough. He came over and he opened up, and he was completely gutted. But he gave me a couple of details from the telemetry, which were just mind-blowing. And we'll talk in more detail about it later. But the most impressive thing was he read out the speed that Alonso was doing when he passed Schumacher around the outside of 130R. Said he was doing an apex speed of 208 miles an hour. with these wheels about half an inch away from Michael's, and in those days 130R wasn't easy for flat. It was much more marginal flat than now, and it wasn't. You do see it's still an unusual move to try and go around the outside there, but you do see it happens, particularly on the first and second laps there. But back then it was just almost unthinkable, and he just did it, and he didn't need to do it. He was already the world champion. He clinched out of the previous race. He just did it because Michael was there and he needed to pass him, and he did it. He did it in that most spectacular way. So yeah, that's how I remember that race.
And to do it to Michael Schumacher as well, of all people. Now, Marc Priestley, welcome back to the show. Good to have you along again. For the rest of the episode, we'll refer to you as Elvis, which is a nickname you are pretty well known for already, and it avoids me having to use everybody's surname all the way through this episode. Now, as I mentioned, you were working on Raikkonen's car that weekend. So what's your overriding memory of Suzuka 05?
Yeah, thank you. Good to be back. My overriding memory of that weekend is, well, the memory that I think of that I remember best and worst is the celebration, because the celebration post-race was epic. It went on for, if I remember rightly, we started in Suzuka, it migrated to Tokyo and then continued over to Shanghai, which was the following race. Went on for 3 days. It was unbelievable.
But poor old Mark was writing his race report, and there you guys were living it up, celebrating your victory. But before we go any further, we should also mention that you've launched a new podcast quite recently. So why don't you tell our listeners all about that and how they can check it out?
Yeah, thanks very much. So this is a brand new thing for me. It's called Pit Lane Life Lessons, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts from or on my YouTube channel. It's basically, since I left the team, what I've started doing is consulting for a lot of business organizations about what lessons we can learn from Formula One. And I've learned so much. I only realized really recently that a lot of the lessons I learned from my time in Formula One, I'm still using every day. So this podcast is essentially a way to pass on some of those lessons to people. Maybe they can take some things that might help them succeed in their everyday lives. That's the idea. So it's Pit Lane Life Lessons.
Definitely one to check out. I've already had a listen. I think I found it through Spotify, but as Mark says, it's cropping up everywhere now. As we all know what the approval process is like for launching a new podcast, but it's gradually turning up everywhere. This is our final regular episode of our third series of Bring Back V10s. I do have a little news update for you quickly. We'll be taking a week or two off after this before we return with our double-header finale, where we'll be answering your questions on F1's V10 era. There's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, it prevents our recording schedule from clashing with the busy F1 testing period, but it also gives me time to move house, which has come up at quite short notice. Once those things are out of the way, we'll be back to see out the series, answering your questions. So make sure you follow @WeAreTheRace on social media and @GlennFreeman39 on Twitter for updates on exactly when we'll be back, but hopefully it won't be too long. That does at least give you a little longer to get your questions in on anything to do with F1 from 1989 to 2005, and you can submit them using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter or by including a question in a 5-star podcast review. That also means it's time for the latest round of shout-outs to our reviewers in what is quickly turning into a game of me failing to keep up with how many of you are leaving us reviews at the moment. So thank you so much to everyone who's getting in touch about the show, including this week, Ashwoody90, Marzal 1974, Weber 46, Rich 1701A, Calibra Turbo Man, Formula Phil, Spenny Boy 5, Paul Glover 7, and Keir Lumsden. There's many more to come, and to be honest, you guys are making it quite difficult to keep up. But let's get on with Suzuka 2005, and it should come as no surprise that Honda was all over the news heading into its home race. Firstly, the Japanese manufacturer upped its 45% stake in BAR to 100%, and that immediately prompted talk of challenging for the World Championship in 2006. But it was at the other end of the grid that a more interesting Honda-related story broke, as Takuma Sato revealed that after being dropped for 2006, he'd been offered a drive with a new unknown team that was trying to get onto the grid. Sato said ahead of his home race, "It's not confirmed that this new team will race, but I have received an offer. A lot of things have happened so quickly, and I'm obviously very excited about this offer. I'm expecting to race in 2006, whether with a new team or an existing team." Honda was initially very coy on what was going on. Honda's operating officer Hiroshi Oshima said, "Bernie Ecclestone has given the team his blessing, and we are looking into the possibility of supplying their engines." Honda Racing president Yasuhiro Wada went further, saying, "It's an independent team already involved in racing and hoping to enter Formula One. They are finalising details, and I don't expect an announcement is too far away. We will have a contract to supply engines and also technical assistance." So who was this mystery team Honda was suddenly linking up with? It was indeed an independent project that had been in the works for around a year by this point. So let's hear from Mark Preston, who was central to those plans and the man who would be technical director at what was to become Super Aguri when ex-F1 driver Aguri Suzuki came calling on behalf of Honda.
I suppose in order to maybe give a little bit of backstory on this, if you remember, Paul Stoddart bought all of the assets of Arrows, and he'd had a sale, an auction down at Ledbury the previous year, I think it was, and I'd gone down there and asked how much would it cost to buy the entire assets of Arrows in order to have the basis of an F1 team. And I think at the time he said $1 million. And then sort of in 2005, obviously the rules had been coming up that there was going to be potential B teams. So if you remember, I think Dave Richards was looking at it as well, I think, to do something with McLaren. And of course, as we learned in that same time period, Red Bull was looking at it with what would become Toro Rosso when they bought Minardi. So the whole thing there was that because of the rule change, everyone was looking at it, and so I think Honda was as well looking at what they should do. And at the same time, obviously Takuma was dropped by HRF1 at the time, and so then I think Aguri was asked to look at the whole process of having a B team. So I don't know quite all the details of what discussions had been going on in Japan, but because of all of the other rules, Honda had definitely been looking at the whole B team scenario anyway, and had been getting Aguri to have a look at that as well. So basically, I think Aguri talked to Daniel Ordetto because Aguri knew Daniel from the days of the Nissan program in Le Mans, which TWR had done. So Tom Walkinshaw had done. So I think that's where the loop came with Daniel. And then Daniel called Kevin Lee, who'd been working with me on how to do a plan. And then we all got together to figure out what could be done. And because we'd been working out all the people we would hire and where we'd go to Leafield, and we'd been sort of figuring out all of the basics of how we'd start really quickly, then that's why it sort of all came together quite quickly. So Aguri came over to see us, and we said, look, this is the plan, this is what we would do if we had all of the pieces of the puzzle. And of course Aguri had Honda, so he had the powertrain, had Bridgestone, had Takuma, and the backing of Honda. So that was quite a surprise that we'd been looking at how you do it for the previous year. And along came someone with all of the pieces of the puzzle that we needed to put something together.
So, Mark, really interesting stuff there from Mark Preston about how this all came together. But was this sudden need for Honda to have a second team on the grid just a reaction perhaps to how badly received BAR's dropping of Sato was taken in Japan?
I don't think it would have happened had it not been for Sato. He was a really big deal for Honda and its marketing in Japan. But he'd done 2 years alongside Jenson Button, and he'd had a bit of a rough time. He'd come in well, he'd made quite a good impression in 04, but he just really, give the impression he'd been sort of psyched out. He wasn't driving with his usual flair throughout most of 2005, and they just felt they needed a more consistent performer. There's sort of the British based part of Honda that was BAR. They felt that they needed a tougher, professional, more experienced driver, and so yes, Honda still very much wanted Sato in Formula One, and I'm sure that was a lot of the impetus behind the creation of Super Aguri, yes.
And Elvis, when you're in a team like McLaren, you're working inside it, that's your whole focus all the time. Does a story like that even register to you guys? Or do you hear about it eventually and just think, okay, that's 2 more cars we're going to have to lap next year?
I don't think we were ever that arrogant about it. I think it doesn't really register in a competitive sense because, let's make no bones about it, for most of the time they were at the opposite end of the grid. But I definitely remember noticing it on a more personal level because we got to know everybody. The mechanics all talked to each other up and down the grid, and there was going to be opportunity for more jobs. We weren't going to lose a team, and knowing what that must, or appreciating what that must feel like to know that, I dreamt of working in Formula One all my life. If that dream was taken away because my team disappeared, I'd have been heartbroken. So the fact that there looked to be at least a secure spot on the grid for those people was, I guess, some comfort for everybody.
Yeah, and as Mark Preston actually explained to us, it brought some people from Arrows back as well who'd lost their jobs mid-season a few years earlier. So good news all round, really. Now, at the other end of the grid, a much bigger driver market story was brewing, and this one was for 2007 rather than 2006, and that was talk that Kimi Raikkonen had signed for Ferrari. Ferrari called it speculation and refused to comment, with Jean Todt adding, "Nobody will push us to say something before we want to say something." Raikkonen didn't exactly pour cold water on the flames, saying, "They are not new rumours, but now everyone knows that my contract is only to next year with McLaren, so maybe it becomes more exciting to write those rumours." Ron Dennis didn't take particularly well to the repeated speculation that was growing by this point. He told the media, "Why don't you believe Kimi? He has told me, his management have told me, and Kimi told a press conference that he hasn't signed a contract with Ferrari. But the only person that can tell you he has not signed a document with Ferrari is Kimi. I can't. I haven't a clue what he has signed." So, Mark, do you think there's actually a hint there from Ron about what perhaps had happened by this stage in 2005, that Raikkonen had signed something with Ferrari, even if it wasn't a contract?
Yeah, I think Ron was pretty much up to date with what was happening. He just couldn't get it confirmed by either Kimi or his management. But yeah, I mean, it was pretty much common knowledge by that time that they were in deep discussion. Kimi and Ferrari were in deep discussion for 2007. And I remember quite late in 2006, it still hadn't been announced, but it was the worst kept secret in the world. And I was sitting in the McLaren motorhome with Kimi's manager, Steve Robertson. And it was known by this time that Alonso was joining the following year. And Steve said, "What do you think they'll do here then from alongside Fernando?" And I couldn't believe he just said that. I said, "Well, it'll be Kimi, won't it, Steve?" He said, I mean, if it's not Kimi." Yeah, so it was quite a badly kept secret.
How badly kept was the secret inside McLaren, Elvis? Did you guys already know that Kimi was probably going to be off at the end of 2006?
I don't think we knew for sure, certainly by the time we got to Suzuka 05. I know the rumours were starting to swirl and, we were raising eyebrows, but we certainly hadn't heard anything official. And Kimi, we had a great relationship around our car crew, the mechanics and the engineers, and Kimi. We were really close. And it was pretty early in 2006 that he did tell me that it was all very much in confidence at that point, hadn't been announced, as Mark said. But we knew quite early on within our group, we had to keep it secret, even from our wider team at that point, because that was some information that had been given to us, on trust, that we were this tight group of mates by that point. So it was devastating, if I'm honest, when we found that out, because although it wasn't surprising because the rumours had been going around for a while, we had this amazing bond, probably the best little team within a team that I've ever been part of. And Kimi was a central part of that, our mechanics, our engineers, Mark Arnold, Kimi's trainer as well. We had an amazing bond, and, we were so close to achieving something incredible. And 2005 was perhaps our best year. So going through 2006, knowing that, that was coming to an end it was pretty devastating, to be honest.
Now, by the time we get to Suzuka, the Drivers' Championship's already been decided, as Mark mentioned earlier, in favour of Fernando Alonso, with Raikkonen missing out after coming close for the second time in 3 years. But Kimi said missing out at the final race in 2003 to Michael Schumacher was much more painful, because in 2005, McLaren saw quite a long time ago it'd be very difficult to catch Alonso and Renault. Now, Elvis, you were there for both title defeats. Was it the same for you? Did 2003 hurt more?
Yeah, it did, because, certainly on a personal level, that was the first time that I'd got into the final day of a season with a chance that we might win it. And I appreciate in 2003, it was still a long shot, but, we came close. And I think what was special about 03 was that we exceeded most people's expectations. Kimi was quite early in his McLaren career. As a group of people, as this little team, we were all very new. That was our first year together as a group. So we felt like we'd exceeded our expectations. And to get to the final day, although I think we probably knew it was a bit of a long shot, we went into that day with a glimmer of hope. And, you got to remember that when you're part of a Formula One team, just like the way a driver grows up dreaming of becoming world champion, we do the same. And, that's the holy grail for us. And we came within touching distance of it. And so, yes, 2003, although, like I say, it was a long shot, it was heartbreaking to have it disappear in that moment. 2005, I felt was a better year, stronger year for us on many levels. We let ourselves down with reliability issues all over the place. But like you say, we could see that picture forming a lot earlier in the season, as opposed to 03 when there was a chance we could do it on the last day.
And Mark, we talked there a little bit about how great 2005 was for McLaren and Kimi. How good was Kimi himself in 2005? Was it his best F1 season?
You get somebody to choose from. He was fantastic throughout his McLaren career. It was his most competitive season because the car was the most competitive car he had during his time at McLaren. But he was fantastic in 2003. You might even say 2006 when the car was not particularly good. He was sensationally good at times that year as well. And he completely blew Montoya away and triggered Montoya's withdrawal from the season halfway through. So yeah, a lot to choose from, but he was pretty magnificent. He's on magnificent form in 2005. Yeah.
Elvis, you were nodding along there. I should ask you the same question, really. You worked with him for all of those seasons. Do you have a favourite, or do you have one that you think was his best?
I think 2005 is probably as strong as we've ever seen Kimi. I mean, I agree with Mark. That was his prime. Those were his prime years, that entire period. So it is quite difficult to pick one over the other. But the fact that we got so many victories in 2005, some of those victories, like the one we're talking about today, came against a backdrop of adversity for various reasons. He was capable of pulling results out of the bag that perhaps the car or the circumstances didn't necessarily deserve on a particular day. And that was one of his strengths. He was no fuss. There was no ego. There was no fuss around anything that he did. We knew that if we gave him a car, he'd pretty much guaranteed to deliver with it.
The Constructors' Championship was still up for grabs at this point, and McLaren, in fact, went into Japan, the penultimate race of the season, 2 points ahead of Renault. But Alonso had the championship he really wanted in his pocket already, and he was surprisingly honest coming into this weekend because he said as much. Alonso said, "For the drivers, the only important thing that motivates you is the Drivers' Championship. The Constructors is good because you feel part of the team, but at the end of the day, it is not so important for you. It's true that there is not the same motivation for the last two races, but I will enjoy these two races because I have no pressure." I think someone might have had a word in Fernando's ear about those comments, because when he got to Japan, he changed his tune slightly, saying, "We have another championship to win. I believe we have been the best in 2005, and I will be working at full power to win the Constructors' title too." In fairness, Raikkonen said something similar at Suzuka. He said the driver's title was the only one that really mattered, but Kimi said what he called the Construction Championship was important for the team and engine supplier Mercedes as well. So Elvis, give us the team member perspective, because you were specifically working on Raikkonen's car, so you had that driver connection, but was one championship more important than the other to you and the guys in your crew?
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head there, because, it's easy to look at it and say, well, the team's championship or the Constructors' Championship must be the one that the teams really want to win. But it does depend where you're working in that team, because when I was working specifically on Kimi's car, more than anything, I wanted to win the Drivers' Championship with Kimi, because that's what I felt my sole focus was on. As a group of people, in all honesty, we didn't really care what happened over the other side of the garage. And that's just the truth. We were solely focused on getting Kimi to the checkered flag first. And, there's always this secondary consideration. Obviously, we want the other car to come up just behind us, but we don't want him in front because he's the enemy at that moment. So in that sense, the people specifically associated to one car want that car to win the Drivers' Championship. However, a few years later, you roll the clocks on, and I was now in a position where I wasn't associated to either car. I was in a more central role in the garage. And in that situation, then totally changed. I wanted the Constructors' Championship, and that then became my biggest focus. So it definitely depends where you sit in a team on any given moment, what your biggest focus or your biggest desire is in terms of championships. But what Kimi and Fernando said in those quotes about the driver only being interested in the Drivers' Championship, 100% true. And anyone that tells you otherwise is lying.
Now, not for the first time in 2005, tyres were in the news this weekend. Firstly, Toyota confirmed its switch from Michelin to Bridgestone for 2006, with Williams also moving over to bolster Bridgestone's ranks after a difficult year where Ferrari was its only front-running team. Toyota said this was a good time to reconsider the contracts about who its tyre supplier was, while Frank Williams said, "We would rather be a serious party amongst a small crowd than one of 7 teams running on Michelins." Now, Mark, we won't go into this too much as it revisits a lot of ground we covered back in our Ferrari 2005 episode in Series 1, but specifically looking at Toyota, 2005 was their best season. They finished 4th in the championship. Was the switch from Michelin to Bridgestone for 2006 actually one of Toyota's many mistakes?
In hindsight, yes, but not because the 2006 Bridgestone was a bad tyre. It was actually a really great tyre, and probably even better than the Michelin in the second half of that year. But the car had been designed around Michelin's, and it was at the time when zero keel and twin keels were how the suspension was mounted were very much the talk up and down the pit lane, and that was to do with aerodynamics, but also to do with the range of camber each tyre type needed, and the Bridgestone needed a lot of camber and the Michelin didn't, so that impacted on the design of the car really. And Toyota had been conceived and developed as a Michelin car, and all of a sudden it was switched to become a Bridgestone car, so that meant quite a lot of re-engineering work, and for a lot of 2006 it was just really regaining the ground that they'd lost with that switch. So it wasn't that the tyre was a worse tyre and 06 was really good. It was just the fact of the change, and that the car hadn't been designed around that.
It was around this weekend that we also got word that tyre changes, which were outlawed in races for 2005, could possibly come back for 2006. Funnily enough, this proposal was being put forward by Ferrari's Ross Brawn and Williams' Patrick Head, whose teams would both be on Bridgestones the following year. Unsurprisingly, Pierre Dupasquier of Michelin wasn't impressed to hear this, but perhaps his reasoning was a bit more surprising. Dupasquier told Autosport, "We talked to our friends from Bridgestone and they said they don't need this new rule, so I don't know why the FIA need to introduce tyre changes again. We had excellent racing this year, why ruin that?" Now, Mark, you've talked in the past about Bridgestone being confident it could design a tyre to suit the no-change rules if they'd stayed in place for 2006. So let's pick up on Dupasquier's second point. Do you think that getting rid of tyre changes did make the racing better in 2005?
I don't know, really. It was just different. I don't know whether it was better or not. What was for certain was that Bridgestone in 2005 didn't have an appropriate tyre for no tyre changes. They had a very different concept of tyre to Michelin, and one that used to run hot and wear a lot more than the Michelin. So the Michelin was, by definition, much better suited, and that no change rule came in very late in the day. So Bridgestone didn't really have a suitable tyre, but for 2006 they did, because basically they copied the Michelin and different compounds, but the construction was very much along the lines of the Michelin, so it was perfectly suited to either type of racing. But I think we had good races in both years. I don't think you could say one was better than the other, really.
And I guess anything after 2004, anything that involved Ferrari not winning every week probably seemed like an upgrade. But Elvis, let's look at the McLaren perspective, because Ron Dennis seemed to be leading the charge against this proposed change in terms of the team bosses. Was there a concern inside McLaren that this could undo some of the great work of 2005 if tyre changes came back?
Well, I think that's exactly the point. We were on a roll as a team. We were looking great. Things were going really well. In fact, one of the only things that was really letting us down in 2005 were things like engine problems and car technical failures. When the car was running well, it ran really well. So, you don't want to upset that. You don't want to destabilize that trajectory that you're on. So that's why Ron was suggesting that. Michelin, as Mark said, Michelin had the better tyre at that point. So you don't want to change it. I have to say, from a personal perspective, I missed the tyre changes in pit stops. It was one of my favourite elements of the weekend, which was gone. And pit stops in 2005 were a really weird kind of scenario where we didn't really do anything. We were checking tyre pressures and things like that in the pit stop, which is a really strange phenomenon. So for me, I would have loved to see them come back, but that's just my own personal preference.
Yeah, pit stops from 2005 are very strange to go back and watch. You sort of got 3 mechanics or whatever it was per wheel, all kind of looking at the tyre and just turning their heads to make it look like they're trying to do something or contribute. So I do sympathise. But you mentioned their engine and technical failures for McLaren, and the real bad news of the weekend at Suzuka came in practice when Raikkonen suffered his 4th engine failure of the season, meaning he would pick up another 10-place grid penalty, which had really derailed his championship charge at various points. But Alonso had an interesting theory on this. He said, McLaren have been very lucky again. I have been saying this all year, but nobody believed me. The 4 engine problems Kimi has had, if they'd happened in the races, then he would have lost 30 or 40 points, and this would have been a big help for me and Renault. He can easily finish on the podium, and it will be difficult for us to beat him in the race, even if he starts 11th. Was it ever interpreted like that inside the team, Elvis? Did you ever think, it's lucky that we get these engine failures, at least because they're in practice? Did Alonso have a point that at least the car didn't break down in the races?
Well, he might have done, but I'd have felt a lot luckier if we didn't have any. It's a good couple of hours' work, apart from anything else. There is an argument to that, isn't there? That any failure in the race costs you more dearly, but that's kind of the point of practice. That's where you push things to maybe further limits, or you try things out because you don't mind to the same extent of failure at that early part of the weekend. So it was probably some of that we were trialing things. Don't forget, of course, we were using different engines on a Friday back then. So it's not quite as straightforward as just being about luck. There is an element to it, but we were unlucky on so many occasions over the course of that 2005 season. And, I'm a firm believer that you sort of make your own luck. So I don't want to complain and moan that, the world was against us. We could have done better. But, the point was, when things were running really well, we were so good. And I think from Fernando Alonso's perspective, he probably knew that. If we hadn't had any of those failures, we would have been, I think, really dominant that season. I think we would have really walked away with it to some extent. As he touched on in that quote you just said there, they couldn't really touch us on many occasions. And it was only the unreliability that probably gave him the shot at staying in that championship and ultimately winning it.
Now, Mark, Mercedes boss Norbert Haug did say this weekend, we have to apologise. And he said, we never speak about luck. We are just not good enough. Is it oversimplifying things to say that if Mercedes had got its act together during this era, Raikkonen would have won the 03 and 05 titles?
A little bit, but it's joint responsibility, isn't it? And for example, there was talk that Adrian Newey was so demanding of Mercedes in terms of how low to get the crankshaft that introduced some technical difficulties, which contributed towards the engine problems. But you could say, where's the blame there? Is it Mercedes for not being firmer, or is it Adrian for being unreasonable? It's always a joint. It's always a joint thing. So I don't think you could say you could put this down solely to Mercedes, even though it was obviously the Mercedes engines that was blowing up. It wasn't the McLaren cars that were breaking down as such. It was usually the engine.
Well, I have to say, I think also Ron Dennis, in the same way that you mentioned there about Adrian, Ron Dennis was pushing so hard during that period of time from everybody, from us within the team. I can only imagine what the pressure he was putting on Mercedes as well. And don't forget, back then, when we look at Formula One engines now, they last forever, don't they? They stay in there for races and races and races. Back then, it was a constant development race from the engine perspective. So we were pushing the thing to the limit, and pressure from Ron to Mercedes to do that, I'm sure, meant that they were really taking some risks in terms of materials and some of the design concepts that they were using in these things. We had a new engine every 5 minutes. So on one hand, you can say, yes, of course, we'd have loved that engine to be more reliable and bulletproof. But on the other hand, them pushing to that level for extra performance also brings with it a whole bunch of benefits. And if they hadn't been doing that, would we have been as dominant when we were running reliably too? Now,
not particularly unique for Suzuka, as we've all seen. Qualifying was wet and windy and rain affected, and it got significantly wetter as the session went on. This was the final season of the somewhat short-lived one-shot qualifying, and the terrible conditions by the end left Alonso 16th and Raikkonen 17th, only ahead of cars that didn't set a time, which included the second McLaren of Juan Pablo Montoya. but that at least meant Raikkonen's grid penalty didn't have an impact. But a second Renault of Giancarlo Fisichella got his lap in just before the worst of the rain hit, so he was up in third, behind a front row lockout for the Japanese manufacturers, with Ralf Schumacher's Toyota on pole, ahead of Jenson Button's Honda. Let's quickly talk about the one-shot format here, as this was a rare example of it producing the sort of mixed-up grids that were hoped for when it was first introduced in 2003. By this stage of 2005, there were rumours now that this would be replaced by some form of elimination-style qualifying in 2006, which was, of course, what we got when the qualifying system we have today with Q1, Q2 and Q3 was first introduced. But Mark, looking specifically at one-shot qualifying, what did you think of it? Were you a fan?
A little bit conflicted. It's not as meritorious as the system that we've got now. It is, a lot of randomness in it, and it makes it very difficult to judge, exactly who's done the best job or what sort of job everyone's done, because there's so many random variables. But it did give us Suzuka 2005, so you can't say it was a bad thing.
What about for the guys inside the team, Elvis? Did you like the one-shot format? I mean, my guess from the outside is that I guess it wasn't as busy as the format that followed.
It wasn't as busy, but it definitely felt like there was more pressure on that one lap, of course. And there were a number of occasions I remember where there'd been a problem in practice on Saturday morning, for example, where maybe another engine had blown up. And, we were up against the clock to get the car rebuilt and back together in time for that one lap. And in a more traditional qualifying format, you have a little bit of leeway about when you actually leave the garage sometimes. But on those days, you didn't. And I remember a number of occasions where we were literally dropping the car back on the floor with Kimi in it, the engine fired up, and almost like a pit stop from within the garage, it would screech out at the last second before the light went red at the end of the pit lane. So the pressure side of it, strangely, I quite liked that because it felt exciting from inside the garage. I think what Mark said there about the fact that you introduced a slightly random element, from a team's perspective, that sometimes feels unfair because you can do everything right and conditions can change like it did on this particular day and you can end up down the back. But I think from a fan's perspective, maybe it added some element to it where we got, like you say, mixed up grids and some randomness often translates towards entertainment, doesn't it?
Yeah, I was a big fan of one-shot qualifying. It didn't always make for the best TV broadcast, perhaps, because it's very samey, but it's what happens on Sunday that really matters, and I think it did mix things up. Now, pole position in Japan meant there was a lot of attention on Toyota. Its technical chief, Mike Gascoigne, didn't mince his words, saying, with so many of the quicker cars so far back, we have to look to capitalise and win the race. Ralph praised the team for bringing the B-Spec car to Japan and said Toyota had a good chance with so many other cars out of position, while team boss Tsutomu Tomita said, it's a dream chance, but luck will be a big factor. We won't be thinking about winning until it happens. We need to be careful of Button. There's also Fisichella, and even though Raikkonen and Alonso are way back, it doesn't mean they won't make a charge. Mark, was there any feeling really that this was a genuine chance of a first win for Toyota, or was Fisichella sitting there as the clear favourite, third on the grid with all of the other quick cars at the back?
Fisi was by far the favourite. I mean, the Toyota was not in the same class as the Renault or the McLaren. But it's a quick-ish car, but not a serious contender. And they opted to fuel it very light and go for a 3-stop strategy when everybody else was doing a standard 2-stop. So it was a very aggressive strategy, and they looked into the pole position by getting the best running slot, but they were ready to make aggressive use of it. But he wasn't the favourite or anything like it. That was definitely Fisi. He was the only properly quick car in the front half of the grid, and so it really looked as though it would be a doddle for him.
And Elvis, what about in the McLaren garage? Was anyone talking about either car coming through to fight for the win, or was it a case of damage limitation?
Well, first of all, on the Toyota thing, I mean, we had, I'm sure this is widely known, but inside the garage, of course, we have software that was very quickly able to calculate the number of laps that a car had been fueled for at the end of qualifying. So we know what their relative pace is and we can figure that out. So I think everybody knew that the Toyota wasn't a real threat to anybody. But Fisichella being up there, of course, was, particularly given the situation in the Constructors' Championship. Both of our cars were way down the back, and all right, Alonso was with us, but one of their cars was right up near the front. So from our perspective, he was very much favourite for that race, and all we could do was get as far forward as we can and see if we could collect some points. I definitely don't think that it was on anyone's radar on Saturday afternoon that we might eventually win this race. That was almost unthinkable at that stage.
Now, one McLaren didn't make it very far at all, with Montoya ending up in the wall at the end of the opening lap when he felt the Sauber of Jacques Villeneuve ran him out of road after the final chicane. Montoya said, "I was 100% beside him and he just pushed me until I was in the grass." Villeneuve said he never saw Montoya because it's a right-handed corner, so you don't look left. And even after seeing it on TV, he added he wasn't worried about getting a penalty for it. But the stewards saw it differently, saying Villeneuve forced Montoya off the track and giving him a 25-second penalty post-race that dropped him from 11th to 12th. So a little bit irrelevant. Ron Dennis wasn't impressed, saying, "I always struggle when people say I didn't see him. I think we all know what peripheral vision is, and I find it hard to believe that anyone can't see another racing car that is squarely alongside him." So, Mark, this was obviously a pretty meaningless penalty for Jacques, but did he have a point that he wouldn't be looking to his left coming back onto that start-finish straight, or was Montoya entitled to try the move that he did?
I think Villeneuve would have been very aware that there would be a good chance that there's somebody there. He and Kimi had their enthusiasm for each other very much under control. They were always at each other. Montoya, sorry. And so Jacques had just been off at the chicane. He'd gone straight on at the chicane, defending from Fernando, and so had come back on the track slow and on a compromised line, and Kimi was next on the scene. So it was obvious Jacques was going to be, potentially there's going to be cars around him looking to pass. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say he wasn't looking to his left.
Well, I'll believe him. But that crash brought out the safety car for 6 laps, which incidentally Ralf Schumacher said cost him a podium finish, as Toyota had gone with that light fuel load for qualifying and the start of the race, but Ralf didn't have the chance to pull away before his early stop. After the restart, Alonso cut the chicane passing the Red Bull of Christian Klein, so he let him back through, then instantly repassed him down the start-finish straight. But he was still deemed to have gained an advantage from cutting the chicane and was ordered to let Klein back through again. Alonso did eventually complete a clean pass into turn 1, but Flavio Briatore felt this moment cost Alonso the race, as the time lost put him in traffic after his first stop, which allowed Raikkonen to jump him. Mark, you analysed these races in great detail, and you certainly did at the time. Was that how you read Alonso's race? Did this moment cost him the win?
Yeah, probably. It cost him in 8.5 seconds immediately in terms of how long he had to wait to allow Klein to catch back up and pass, and then the lap following Klein, and then the following lap getting past him. Cost him an immediate 8.8 seconds. But without that 8.8 seconds, he wouldn't have been jumped by Michael and Kimi at the stops. And so he would have been ahead then, because he was at the head of that queue eventually. So yes, I would say they've got a very good case to say that it may have lost him the race. But on the other hand, would Alonso have put a committed pass on his teammate Fisi in the way that Kimi did? So it would have ended up a very different race, I think.
Just as interesting. But what do you think, Elvis? Did Alonso do McLaren a favour here?
Well, my heart bleeds for him, first of all. I guess, clearly it played a role in that. But I was so focused on what we were doing that day and the emotion that went into that end result. And in fact, all the way through that race, we were just progressing. I don't really think I had too much of an eye on what Alonso was doing. And of course, when you see a penalty come up for your main rival, although the championship in that sense was over at that point, there's a little bit of you that jumps for joy, even if you keep it inside you. In fact, I'm not even sure I did keep it inside of me that day. I may well have actually jumped for joy. But yeah, he may well have a point, as Mark said, as he's analysed it, and those numbers do tend to stack up. But look, Kimi was on an absolute charge that day, and there's a big part of me believes that I'm not sure that anybody could have got in Kimi's way that day and not had to put up a really serious fight to keep him behind.
We'll break off from the major players for a moment here, because shortly after all that was going on, Takuma Sato and Jarno Trulli collided at the chicane. And by collided, I mean Sato drove into Trulli at the chicane. Trulli called the move obviously impossible, and he said Sato has been causing problems for a long time and the FIA has to take action to stop it. I have nothing against Takuma, he is a nice guy, but when he is in the car, he does not think. He never listens, so he will make the same mistakes again. When I saw him in the mirror, I knew I was doomed. Sato called it a racing incident, which I think is often the view of the guilty party in these situations, while Toyota boss Tomita called it reckless, saying to Reuters, I'm all in favour of aggressive driving, but Sato goes way beyond what is acceptable. The stewards seemed to agree, and Sato was disqualified, although again, much like the Villeneuve penalty, I'm not sure that meant much, given he finished 13th. Mark, Taku had also been off at the start, running wide at turn 1. Do you think those few laps that he did, or this whole race, was just an example of him trying too hard on home soil?
He's under massive pressure. You know, he'd been under pressure all year, trying to keep his drive, and then he's now in front of his home crowd, and on the circuit owned by Honda, his employer. So yeah, he was, I think, very disappointed at his level of performance and trying to put it right and just trying to snatch at opportunities as they came along. And it wasn't, he wasn't in the right frame of mind to fulfill his potential. I think later on, Super Aguri, he blossomed into a great driver, fantastic driver, and of course he's had that fantastic success at Indy Sun. So he was a real late bloomer, but in that particular case and on that day, he was wild and over the top.
Now let's get on to one of the most famous moments from this race, and one that Mark mentioned briefly earlier, because Alonso and Raikkonen were nose to tail stuck behind the Ferrari of Michael Schumacher early in the race, but Alonso eventually found his way through with a daring pass on the outside of the famous 130R corner. So Mark, you talked a little bit about the data from this pass earlier. How good was this move? And does the fact that 130R had been tamed a little bit a few years earlier take anything away from it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, it was a stunning move. It was a potentially fatal move if it went wrong. If Michael had understeered a little bit and collected, because Fernando's on the outside and interlocked wheels, you can only imagine the sort of aircraft accident that would have unfolded. It took enormous balls and commitment to do that, to Michael of all people. That year's Renault was a better car than the Ferrari. The Ferrari was nobbled by its tyres, but even so, that was one of the bravest and most committed moves I've ever seen.
And an element of trust, of course, placed in Schumacher's hands. They were still pretty close at the point that Fernando decided he was going to make his way somewhere towards the apex. So brilliant driving, and I always think that great overtaking moves often require the driver being passed to show a little bit of respect as well. But Raikkonen didn't get past Schumacher prior to them both stopping at the same time on lap 26, which was 4 laps after Alonso had been in. But Alonso's time lost in traffic after his stop meant they still rejoined ahead of him, with Schumacher still ahead of Raikkonen thanks to taking on 1 second less of fuel in his stop. Raikkonen finally got past Schumacher on lap 30, although by this point he was now 17 seconds behind Fisichella, who was leading the race. So Elvis, there are 23 laps left at this stage. In the McLaren garage, was there a feeling that all that time spent behind Schumacher had probably cost Kimi a shot at victory?
Yeah, I think so. Or definitely made it a lot less easy. I actually think by that point we were really genuinely starting to believe that he could catch Fizzy. Whether we could get past him, of course, was another story altogether. But Kimi was in such a mood that day where he was on a mission to get past anyone in his way. And I honestly felt if we could get close enough and with a couple of laps still to do it, to have a go, he would have found a way past. So I honestly think that's probably the moment where we started to feel like, do you know what, this might actually just happen. It was such an unlikely set of circumstances, but that was the moment where we thought, maybe this is going to get interesting.
Alonso passed Schumacher again 3 laps later, although in that time he'd lost 6 seconds to Raikkonen. Raikkonen had more traffic to deal with though, as he quickly caught Button's Honda and Mark Webber's Williams that were running second and third. When they pitted, Kimi put on a stunning charge. At times at this point in the race, he was lapping more than 2 seconds quicker than anyone else. Fisichella had made his final pit stop by this stage, and by the time Raikkonen came in for his final stop, he did so with a 10.7 second advantage over the Renault and rejoined 9 seconds down at the end of lap 45 of 53. A lap later, that gap was down to just 5.4 seconds. Then it became 4.3, 3.0, 1.8, and then 0.5 with 3 laps to go. Mark, what was Fisichella doing at this point? Pat Symonds claimed afterwards that Fisi had run out of tyres, but we also saw him defending into the final chicane when Raikkonen wasn't even trying to pass him. Did Fisi throw this one away?
Yeah, he did. It was the stint before that, was the penultimate stint, where he just clearly hadn't understood how quick Kimi and also Alonso were coming through, because he just wasn't lapping on the pace. He was just lapping as though he was in control of the race, because he had a big gap back to second place, and as though it hadn't actually been triggered. The fact that the car behind, a long way behind, wasn't actually his threat. It was the one behind that. And by the time the final stops and Kimi was now the car behind, it was more or less too late, because Kimi was just on an absolute mission, and Fisi did actually switch on the pace at that point, and it was pretty quick in that last stint, just not quite as quick as Kimi. But if he'd driven his penultimate stint as well as he drove the last stint, he would have been. I don't think Kimi would have been able to catch him. So yeah, the damage was done in the penultimate stint, and yeah, as you say, Fisi was defending the chicane before Kimi had actually arrived there, which just slowed him even more.
Yeah, Martin Brundle was particularly scathing of that on the commentary at the time, and we got lots of shots of the Renault pit wall and the anguish as I think Alan Permain was trying to get Fisi to pick the pace up a bit sooner. Now, Elvis, we won't quite come to the final move just yet, but let's put ourselves in 3 laps to go. Kimi's on Fisichella's tail now. By this point, did you think it was inevitable that he'd win, or was there that nagging feeling that in the days before DRS, Suzuka wasn't the easiest place to pass and he wasn't going to have many opportunities?
Yeah, it was that one. Because, getting behind is one thing, getting past is another. And I think particularly with 3 laps to go, okay, yeah, it's definitely a possibility. But as we get down to 2 laps to go and then 1 lap to go, you started to think, do you know what, maybe this isn't going to be quite the fairy tale that it would have been. However, second place would have been incredible from starting where we were. That would have been great. Having got that close, and with Kimi on the form that he was on that day, and us, that Mark just touched on that final stint, or the penultimate stint, where Fizzy was perhaps not as quick as he should have been. I would counter that by saying Kimi's penultimate stint was mind-blowingly fast, and those laps before his final pit stop really did bring him back into the picture. And then, of course, when he came out and he had, he could see almost Fizzy down the road, that was it. He had the bit between his teeth. So, we were on such a great roll that getting to those last 3 laps, I think nobody really wanted to settle for second, although it would have been a great result. It would have been tinged with a bit of disappointment having come so close.
Now, before we get to the conclusion of that battle at the front, we will pick up on Alonso's race. Button and Webber rejoined from their final stops ahead of him, and Webber had jumped Button for what was now 3rd place. Alonso made short work of Button, but it took him until 5 laps to go to get Webber for 3rd. The Williams didn't give Alonso much room on the pit straight, and Alonso had a wheel on the grass after using a bit of the pit exit to make the pass. There's onboard footage of this in the 2005 F1 season review DVD, and all I will say is that's well worth a watch. Now, Mark, we've talked about the pass on Schumacher at 130R already, but I know you also have quite a lot of admiration for this move that Fernando pulled off as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the bits of telemetry Pat Symonds was showing me after the race. He actually, as he went to put a wheel on the grass and didn't lift, he actually got wheel spin in top gear on the grass, and it still came through. Yeah, it was fantastic.
Yeah,
those when Webber and Alonso went wheel to wheel, it was always pretty phenomenal. You remember Eau Rouge that year when they went through Eau Rouge side by side?
Yeah, two hard chargers who certainly don't back off, and so much for Fernando racing with no pressure and taking it a bit easy because he'd already won his championship. But let's get back to the battle for the lead. Raikkonen had a little look into turn one on the penultimate lap, and Fisichella covered it. But next time round at the chicane, Fisichella again drove way too defensively and compromised his exit onto the front straight. Raikkonen got another run then at the start of the final lap. Fisichella covered it again, and Raikkonen swooped around the outside to grab the lead, giving us a brilliant finish to an incredible Grand Prix. Now, Elvis, I don't expect you to analyse this pass in any particular detail. We can do that with Mark in a second. But what was it like inside the McLaren garage at that moment?
Oh, it was amazing. After the final pit stop in the race, we know there's no more. The crash helmets, the pit stop crash helmets and balaclavas come off. And you're sat there in those final moments, gripping the seat to the point where your knuckles are white. And they must have replayed this recently on F1's social channels, because my Insta and Twitter just blew up with people sending me clips of this moment. And as part of the montage of footage, there's a clip of me leaping out of a chair, celebrating at the time when Kimi got past. And I can only describe it as, the most pent up frustration up until that point, where he came close, it didn't work. He came close, it didn't work. And then in that moment, all hell broke loose in our garage. There were just chairs being scattered everywhere. Everyone leapt up and leapt around. And it was the most amazing feeling, partly because of where we'd started the race and it was so unexpected. But also, like I touched on before, this idea that our little gang, our little crew around this car with Kimi at the centre of that was such a great bunch of mates by this point. This is the end of a season almost. And to have that success that you knew the world was watching and yet could not believe what was happening. And we couldn't believe it either. But so, yeah, it was an amazing outpouring of emotion in that moment. And like I said before, led on to one hell of a celebration.
Even Ron Dennis said he was emotional after the race, calling it the best race of Kimi's career. Raikkonen said, of course, it was a more difficult win than any of the others. And he said it was made even tougher by his seventh gear being a little short. So he kept hitting the rev limiter when trying to overtake people on the straights. He said that happened when he went to the outside of Fisichella, but in Kimi's words, I kept it in as much as I could around the outside of the first corner. So Mark, looking at the pass itself, how good was this from Kimi? And I guess we could say it was a fitting end to a brilliant drive.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, it was a classic committed around the outside pass, and he wasn't. He was always going to do it. He was, once he'd put himself on that outside, he was always going to make the pass. And I don't think it would have mattered if Fissy had got out of the way or not. It was a magnificent performance. I do think probably it was Kimi's best ever race, and I think it was also Fernando's best ever race. And I think that's what makes this race so special, because you had two just absolutely unbelievable performances, slightly different circumstances, but just around a circuit like that, one of the greatest Grand Prix circuits of all, that should all come together with those sort of performances. I think is what, for me, that's the best Grand Prix I've ever seen, and I've seen quite a few of them now.
It was definitely one of my favourite to be involved in. And you just said there, Glenn, about Ron sounding emotional. I mean, he cried. There are not many occasions in my McLaren career where I've seen Ron cry, and that was definitely one of them. He was emotional to the point where he couldn't get words out. And this is one of the most straight-talking, serious, controlled people that I've ever met, and yet he lost it at the end of that race. And that sort of summed up the mood of the team. We were all overcome by emotion.
Now, this was a 2-3 for Renault, and with Montoya crashing out in the other McLaren, that meant Renault moved 2 points ahead in the constructors' battle, but that seemed of little consolation to a team that had just lost the win on the final lap. And as Mark mentioned earlier, Pat Symonds wasn't particularly keen in talking about it until Mark just wouldn't let him wriggle away. Now, Pat also expanded on his theory about Fisichella's tyres, saying Raikkonen and Alonso were able to save tyres while they were stuck in traffic, whereas Fisi had been pushing hard out front. Mark, do you think there was some validity to that? I mean, from what you were saying earlier, it sounds like Fisi wasn't pushing hard enough, and surely when you're running in dirty air of the other cars, looking after your tyres is actually quite difficult.
Yeah, I don't think. I think Pat was trying to soften the blow for Fissy. I don't really. Looking at the circumstances of each of their races, Fissy's, Kimi's, and Alonso's, I don't think you can make a serious case that Fissy was at a disadvantage.
Also, Kimi didn't know how to save tyres. He only had 2 settings. It was on or off.
Now, Flavio Briatore did say the defeat was painful, but he also said Raikkonen deserved it, and he said the race was good for Formula One, adding, "We need every race like that. It was a good fight. I'm not saying we are happy, but we enjoyed it." So we'll finish on that point, because this debate has been somewhat topical in the last year or so with the chat around reverse grids in F1, a move that's of course been rejected. This race wasn't a full-on reverse grid. We had solid midfield cars at the front, a Renault on the second row, and the backmarker Minardis were only 13th and 15th, so we can't call it fully reversed. But Mark, I'll come to you first on this. Was this race a good advert for jumbled grids in F1?
I guess it was, but I would make a distinction between deliberately engineering a jumbled grid and the weather just randomly arriving and making the system that you've got produce a jumbled grid. One of them is artificial and the other one's not.
And Elvis, you got to experience your car winning pretty much from the back of the grid and the jubilation that came with that. So would you be an advocate for top teams and drivers having to come through like that on a regular basis?
Well, look, this all comes down to a much bigger question of what F1 wants to do, doesn't it? Because from a team's perspective, of course, you're going to feel like whatever you do on a Saturday, even if you're incentivized to go, all out on a Saturday and get points for qualifying or whatever, you're then going to feel like you're being unfairly penalized by being shoved to the back of the grid. But from a fan's perspective, yeah, of course, Suzuka 05 gives this idea that if there's an opportunity for fast guys at the back and they have to make their way through, that's great entertainment. The difference, as Mark said, if you're doing that every week, the teams will learn to game it and they will learn to prepare for that scenario. What was great about Suzuka 05 was that it was random, it was unexpected, and therefore we had to think, on the fly and deal with it. And deal with it we did, and it came out really well.
Yeah, we'll leave it there for Suzuka 05 then, and that's also the end of our regular episodes for Series 3. As I mentioned at the start, you'll have to wait an extra week or two for our final episodes when we'll be back taking your questions on anything to do with F1 from 1989 to 2005. That means there's still time to submit your questions using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter or by leaving us a 5-star podcast review if you think we deserve it. Thanks to everyone who has submitted a question or a review already, and thanks today to the two Marks for their first-hand memories of being at Suzuka in 2005. Keep an eye on @WeAreTheRace and @GlennFreeman39 for updates on when our short break will be over. In the meantime, make sure you check out Mark's new podcast, Pit Lane Life Lessons, and we'll see you again very soon when the power will be in your hands for the final 2 episodes of the series.